Bjorn asked me if I was going to talk about quantitative or qualitative data, and I'm much more of a qualitative researcher. I'm interested in the cultures of engagement, just to give you a cue in case you wanted lots of facts. But I am going to present some data from other people just to give you some indicators of some of the issues that surround the context that I'm speaking about today. If anybody's interested in the references I have, I'll make the PowerPoint available through ZKM, but the material is all available. You're more than welcome to ask me for it. I should just ask, given Regina's introduction, I should just make a point that although the project has been running for a couple of years, most of my observations concern the nature of how cultural institutions interact with each other in trying to engage audiences. So who the audience is yet to be fully established, but I'll try and give you some insight into some of the challenges for thinking about that question. So this is the context for the talk today, just to get ahead. I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes and then pass over to Bjorn. So our concern is with the development of audiences, who the audience is, how we engage them. And for me, this is about the relationship to some degree between cultural institutions under the aegis of public policy and the nature of how we think about what culture is, and the techniques but also the demands of running commercial businesses. One of the insights from smARTplaces, for instance, is that across European partnerships, the demands placed upon institutions vary. Seems to be quite obvious, but coming from a UK context in which all public institutions were made free for entry is not the same across Europe or across the world. And techniques for engaging audiences aren't all developed by altruistic means. They also come from, let's call it the altruism of commerce, or perhaps the less altruistic element of it. So the inflection of this engagement is not just about getting people into cultural institutions, but also about the nature of how the digital plays out and it has a role in engaging people, which may or may not lead to audiences who actually turn up at places like ZKM or Veals or whatever. And what I want to do in my talk is not so much identify who the audience actually is, but try and posit a particular way of thinking about the audience as a smart audience, as an object for discussion, and maybe even for challenge. And I do this in the spirit of being a seeker of knowledge, because most of the people here are those who are engaged with actual living audiences. So as a researcher and an interpreter, I come with the aim of learning from you. I should also add that in case you think I seem clairvoyant, I've learnt a lot from the panels already today, so I've tried to incorporate mention of some of them where I see them connecting or prompting some of my own thinking. So you'll see, hopefully, or I might make mention of that. Okay. One of the things I've been thinking about in my own work, Regina mentioned the cultural intermediation project that works with hard-to-reach audiences, is I've written a bit about the prompt for pan-European policy that directs cultural engagement, largely stemming from the Article 151 and subsequent treaties, which are presented, as a number of commentators have suggested, a particular challenge for culture at the European level. And I say this as someone currently struggling with Brexit, so you'll understand the politics of culture are red raw to me. That the European Union is challenged, if you will, by making cultural pronouncements, funding culture, and seeking to galvanise culture, or even the creative industries, by trying to balance a pan-continental impulse to try and develop identity and cohesion, while at the same time balancing the diversity of the separate identities, not only of individual countries, but often the separate entities within countries themselves. I did have some figures, which I'm not going to reach for now, but the 27, soon to be 27 countries of the EU is subdivided by even greater amounts of ethnicities, languages and identities, as my Belgian colleagues or Spanish colleagues will no doubt attest. The impulse of cultural policy, again, as we'll know, is at one level, both in Europe, but I speak again from the British paradigm too, and also knowledge of some of the ways in which individual countries work across the EU, is to see accessibility as an important aspect of the provision of culture, that we seek to reach audiences, not just to provide to those who are already equipped with the appurtenances of culture or the taste for culture, but as part of our drive for citizenship, to nurture full citizenship, we're obliged in public institutions to reach out to audiences through cultural programming or to the ways in which we seek to mediate our wonderful assets and also the type of activities we do. In the work of Dave O'Brien and Kate Oakley in the UK on the nature of cultural diversity and cultural policy, they've suggested, from our perspective at least, that cultural engagement is now part and parcel of the practice and obligations of government. It's part of modernity to such an extent and such a set of anxieties that cultural engagement has become a marker of a particular type of normality. In the end, if you don't go to art galleries or go to dance, there's something wrong with you, or people are worried that you perhaps aren't getting your full share of the goods that society has to offer. Okay? These issues of access and engagement, both for the hard to reach but more widely, you'll no doubt be aware have been dealt with quite widely in the literature. I've been reading a collection on engagement at the moment and read an engaging essay from one of our Spanish colleagues, Emma Guinot, who says that she's not suggesting, by the way, this is particularly new. This is a capture of something that's happened for museums and galleries in general. This is a period in which, you know, democratisation is writ large, in which a whole set of mission statements and expectations are placed upon the curator, the PR department, the staff, the cafe, no doubt, about the ways in which we operate and seek to engage people. Alongside the desire for engagement, and if you like, what I introduced at the start, the idea of the pan-European project of the EU, but which is also manifest in the smARTplaces project, this is nothing particularly new. The desire to reach not only the uninvolved audiences locally, but the international audience. So Guinot identifies in a number of case studies in Spain a number of museums or galleries that are already dealing with audiences of enormous diversity, not just locally, but international. This is no new thing. I'm sure that ZKM has quite a, as today, quite an interesting reach across the world. People who will go out of their way to visit places like MNAC, Prado, ZKM, the Victoria and Albert in the UK. However, as researchers like Tali Katz-Gero has suggested, when we start to dig down into the nature of how the audience, how the user, how the attendees are organised, she suggests we know very little about who comes. Who are the French who come, pardon me, who may come to ZKM or go to the UK. And looking at this both across Europe or across the world presents a particular set of challenges. Is anybody familiar with this research at all? This is published this year, but Tali has published several pieces across the year and makes good use, as I suggest here, of the Eurobarometer research to find out more about what is actually happening and what can we learn about this interrelationship at a European level, about the international audience. And one of the things she's been interested in is what happens within individual countries about how we consume material from other countries, non-national consumption, which, as you can imagine, for a project like smARTplaces, is a manifest challenge. What happens to the Belgians in Wiels when presented with particularly digital material that takes place from ZKM, but also about the relationship between the circulation of physical materials and the invitation to interact. I've got some data here just to show you what Tali Katz-Gero has to say, and I won't show too much of it, but just to point out, it's perhaps not that surprising to find out that in terms of frequency of consumption, people who consume material not from their own country are less frequent than those who do it quite a lot. No surprises. And this data derived from Eurobarometer tells us about things like theatre, concerts, reading a book, and useful for us at a place like ZKM, but also across the cultural institutions of smARTplaces, are insights into the visits to historical sites, but also engagement with festivals and exhibitions. So we see that the frequency is not great for a significantly small amount of the audience. This is not that unsurprising, I guess. Tali Katsgera goes into more detail, which I think is interesting. This is all interesting, by the way, don't let me turn you off it, but about the difference between types of country and what we can expect from them. And there's some generalizations in this work about the nature of small countries and how the nature of consumption of other countries' assets are writ larger. And there's some interesting political and cultural points she makes in this work. Again, I won't blind you with someone else's research because it's all available, and I'm happy to share this on her behalf with you, but it's all published. And there are particular insights into the relationship between consumption and the economics of individual countries. Okay, but the conclusions about the nature of the likelihood of consumption are the key thing here. And what she does is she identifies a theme of cosmopolitanism in the nature of audiences and how we consume and engage with the assets and culture of other countries. Cosmopolitanism is a way of describing our openness, our ability to identify with this, in our case, a pan-Europeanism. Again, I say this as a Brit with some reservation, given I perhaps am not the best expert to think about issues of tolerance and engagement. But cosmopolitanism is also a way of identifying the ways in which, again, in familiar ways, culture and its consumption is a mode of marking out one's status. And as I suggested from the previous slide, there are limits presented in how this works in individual countries and quite a diffuse relationship between them. But the cosmopolitan is someone who tends to be educated, one of the beneficiaries of globalization. The winners and losers of globalization are quite important in thinking about the likelihood of our ability to engage audiences. So I suspect that, well, we'll come back to who's a cosmopolitan in a moment. But again, what's important here is, in a Bourdieusian sense, Katsgera is also identifying the way in which culture is mobilized in a benign way, but also as a marker of differentiation and distinction. The cosmopolitan is quite an interesting figure, I think, if we sit it alongside other ways of thinking about audience segmentation and about the ways in which, in this case, I derive an image from British provider Hargreaves that seeks to identify different types of audience motivation. But when this happens, it seems to me, and again this goes back to my first slide about differentiating between the commercial imperatives or even the marketing imperatives of cultural institutions and our social imperatives, the ability to dig deeper into motivation in this way strikes me as identifying a relationship or even a differentiation between the benign and the problematic. Those who we don't reach, for obvious reasons, are harder to identify and to map in terms of who they are. And if we see culture as a marker of distinction, thinking about those who resist culture, who are perhaps not just resisting, but impervious or don't hear about it, is quite a challenge. How do we reach them? And again, the cosmopolitan is a way of thinking about figures who are already benefiting, already come prepared for culture, or even go after it, okay? Which is fine if one wants to fill halls full of the people who are already benefiting from things. But if we want to fulfill a social mission, or even the obligation of culture in order to nurture citizenship and participation, that becomes problematic. So I won't delve too much into the nature of that particular type of segmentation. But let's turn to smARTplaces. Already, smARTplaces, hopefully you'll know about this, are already physically trying to involve themselves in demonstrating the diversity of our exchange of cultural assets across the partnership. Here's an image of the engagement between the Musée de Picardie and the Landesmuseum of Liechtenstein, which involves the physical sharing of a particular cabinet of curiosities that goes around particular locations. And it seems to be, again, if you're not familiar with these locations, there are obvious differences about their location and the type of audience that they can expect, and also seek to engage. It's one of the ways in which we demonstrate the wide cultural diversity and engagement of the project. More recently, smARTplaces has begun to spread its wings around the nature of how it seeks to engage digitally, about the exchange between our institutions, and therefore the engagement with audiences who may not be just within the domain of our institutional geographies. We can't put things online and just expect that those in France or Germany or Spain will engage. Hopefully, this will reach more widely. So I don't know, did anybody see this talk from Ascuna recently that was broadcast on? Well, you did. Okay. So this was a 30-minute discussion with the curators and the artists involved in Ascuna's current exhibition. It ran as a live presentation. I keep using the term broadcast as though this is television, and as I'll mention in a moment, this is a bit of a misnomer. And one could type in questions and engage directly, and you can still listen to this talk. Okay, it uses a widely accessible format, Facebook, which is great because you may never go to Ascuna. You may never want to go there, but it doesn't mean you can't find out about what's going on there. But it struck me in planning this talk, I was presented with a number of reflections, which is, I imagine I'm a cosmopolitan. I might be the type that Katsgero has spoken about. And I tried to imagine, not only in consuming this, the enjoyment I got out of it and the satisfaction, but a number of questions were posed to me that I imagined might be posed to an audience in general, those who would be already switched on, but those who might be missing this. Yeah? How am I part of an audience? Who do I belong to? What can I do with this material? What's possible with this kind of practice, which is core to the question of smARTplaces? And that then led to a number of reflections about the potential for the digital on this project and others too, to do the kind of engagement that reaches beyond cosmopolitans like myself, cosmopolitans like you. Are these new mediations? What kind of new challenges are presented by offering the digital or mediating in the digital for our institutions, but also our wider cultural remit at EU level, national level, or institutional? And one of the things that struck me immediately, and this is where I mention or was struck by Oliver's comment this morning about data realization, about the idea of giving data beauty. The first thing to say about the digital is the digital is not just a shop window that points a camera at things that happen in Zekhem or Ascuna. It must have its own essence. It must have its own way of operating. Okay? And I wondered, what would this mean? How is this manifest? And one of the things that I'm very grateful for was my colleague Aurélie in the Musée de Picardie has been sharing more widely some of the ways in which museums and social media interact. And here's a good example of this in action on Twitter. I don't know if everybody's familiar with this. It's a relatively small initiative run by a PhD student out of France under the label @Museo-Lepsis. And it uses the essence of Twitter and hashtags to allow you to go through an experience of investigating and exploring a museum. And what you do, you're presented with a number of threads. By the way, this is automatically translated. It's in French if you go to the site. You are the hero who's invited to go and explore the museum. I like the fact that you need to be heroic to explore museums. And as one goes through it, you have an option, and you can follow a number of options to get some sound support. And as you go deeper, you can go downstairs, you can go upstairs, you can stop and look at particular offerings in that museum. The interesting thing is, as I say, this seems really simple, but it makes use of the essential properties that Twitter offers, which I think may emulate games of chance or things that we already do in museums and galleries, but also seeks to offer something that is integral to the medium. And that's the way it seems to me to think about these things. Now, I'm just thinking about time, so I'm just going to make a comment and then move on very briskly towards a challenge, not a solution, but a proposition. Lest I seem celebratory about the optionality of the digital, we're faced with a challenge which emulates the things I discover in my own research, and you'll know already from attempts to reach audiences. This is drawn from some UK research, which is simply the fact that if we think about hard-to-reach audiences, the disengaged, citizenship and otherwise, the digital is not necessarily an immediate solution. There's a huge issue around digital literacy, for me at home and also abroad, more generally about those who are engaged, not just simply because they are literate, but it actually costs to be digital. We may think that owning a mobile phone or having access to free platforms is quite straightforward, but of course it costs money. And, you know, the economics of the household, the economics of survival mean that quite a lot of people are not afforded the indulgence of engagement with the digital. So that presents us with a challenge for thinking about, does this offer a solution? If you're interested in the research, I was just going to show you some slides that just demonstrate the relationship between engagement and social status and class. And again, this is all freely available online from Ofcom, but anybody who wants it, see me and I'll share this with you. And the slides I was going to show you just demonstrate this for the UK at least, and I think in terms of Eurobarometer and other types of research, this is not exactly mapped across Europe, but we can see parallels about social class, ethnicity, age, and perhaps other social variables. I'm going to wrap things, well, I'm going to move things on quickly because I'm on about 20 minutes, if that's okay. The point is to go back to thinking about what the digital offers, is to start thinking about, and again, I suspect this is not particularly new to those who are already fully engaged, although not all of us are yet fully appraised of the potential of both social media or even the digital world. We think about the challenges of even reaching the people outside our institutions, let alone those who are online, who may be part of broader communities. But if we start to imagine the digital as offering not just new geographies, but new places, treated in the right way, they offer us, and this emulates what's happening already online, where many people are engaged in practices that are independent of cultural policy. It's quite a big issue. Is that if we follow this suggestion from Carly Budge and Ali Burness, is that thinking about the digital as a third place, as a humanising space, it offers us new ways of bringing communities together, not just for the benefit of culture, but thinking about cultural interaction more generally. And I don't think the digital is fully explored yet for the potential it has to not just get people into physical places, but also to work in order to fulfil the social and cultural mission of institutions. What I wanted to suggest as a kind of step towards a summary of what I see as the potential for the smARTplaces project is to think about the idea of the smart audience as a name for what we expect of digital engagement. Digital engagement takes place in and outside of institutions. You come to ZKM, you can get the app, right? And you can learn a lot and interact with things in the museum. When I'm at home, I can see a lot about what goes on in ZKM just by going on the website and following the Twitter feed. So a number of ways of thinking physically, geographically, and imaginatively about the kind of places that we engage in. When I do this, when I'm on Twitter, when I'm following a thread or when I'm thinking about it, I'm actually engaged in what a number of researchers have identified as a kind of labour. We add value to the kind of activity. In fact, we add value where social media and digital is working well, where it seeks to engage us. And in that sense, I think it's worth asking of audiences, what's in it for them? What do you get out of audiences by asking them to participate, to share your message, to leave a comment, or just add a like to your Facebook group? And it seems to me this is a way of thinking about how audiences are increasingly involved in a kind of co-production, co-curation, but also perhaps deserving of forms of credit, and also ways of thinking about them as citizens, not just consumers or audiences. Researchers like Radbourne have said that what really matters in engaging audiences is the offer of a quality experience. Social media, as I suggested at the start, or digital, is not just an issue of trying to emulate television or point a camera, but think about what is it that happens in the digital that matters for itself. It can't replace what happens in ZKM. That would be impossible. It's a splendid, enormous building in which the physical experience of being in, whether it's the video game exhibition or just having visited, is completely different, philosophically, imaginatively, to engaging online. But there's an important relationship to be nurtured there. An issue of quality is one to think through about how we engage and what we offer to the participant and what we can do with it. Budge and Burness, in a study of the selfie, would you believe, and it's used in Australian museums, say that despite reticence of curators, the selfie isn't just a replacement for showing people what happens in a museum or a gallery. It's a way of the audience, the participant, demonstrating their agency, achieving some kind of authority, and also communicating their sense of authority about their knowledge, sometimes their trepidation, their taste, their very fact that they went to a museum. And there's a lot to be gained from this. To step towards a conclusion, these kind of engagements seem to me to connect with ways of thinking about how we think about participation rather than consumption, about Sherry Arnstein's well-used ideas that, in the end, citizenship involves a form of collaboration, a form of authority, a form of agency. In order to nurture new audiences, give them opportunities, I think this is about thinking, well, what's in it for them? Not because it's about a trading relationship, but it's about a collaboration. So what's at stake in this is thinking, I don't know if this is thinking anew about the audience, but I think it's encouraging us to reassess what we think we're doing with audiences, whether they are customers, clients, objects, or, again, as I suggest, whether they're best thought of as collaborators. I know a lot of enlightened curators, museologists and others already think like this, but I think this is what we can learn about the impulse of what we do and its reality. It has implications for me in thinking about how we determine what the audience is in terms of labelling them, objectifying them, but also finding ways to cultivate and nurture them. To some extent, rather than seeking to find out what audiences want, this is also about thinking about leadership. As cultural institutions are already engaged in learning, if I've suggested this is in some way signalling that audiences need to ask what's in it for us, cultural institutions also have to say and assert what's in it for the collective, what's in it for the cultural offer. We have to be cautious, and I think, again, I look at the audience here and other places I've spoken to, because smARTplaces sits alongside many other initiatives that are forever pursuing audiences, seeking to map them, identify them and nurture them. And that can create not only fatigue for the audience, it might create fatigue for you as curators and, you know, poor researchers like me and Bjorn who have a really difficult job. But it's also a way of increasingly thinking about audiences in fragments. But audiences are fragments, they're individuals. Potentially, as we learned about data gathering earlier and social media and the digital, we're able to learn richer things about the audience. But unless we gather that, we're not going to be able to articulate it better. But it's possible that, to use Clay Shirky's phrase here, by so doing, maybe it's fame rather than fortune we pursue. We're not able to necessarily translate this into commercial outcomes, which might not be the point, as per the panel and the discussion this morning. Paralleling Google might not be seeking to not do evil or dominate the world. It might be that we generate better citizenship. It may be that we help people, if that's the right word, to learn about culture, and if they choose not to participate, that's entirely fine. But it's our obligation to ensure that our cultural assets, which are collectively owned or collectively pitched, are important. Okay? It's my job or mine and the job of others on the smARTplaces project to try and understand how this project seeks to demonstrate that potential. And I think the idea of the smart audience, again, if the audience is the right word, is one way of thinking about the nature of how we proceed. And I'll stop there for the moment. Okay?